To that end, I would like to introduce you to the author of For the Hog Killing 1979, the photographer here in reference. Bob Jensen wrote in Yes Magazine just a year or two ago, and I'm quoting here, "Here's my portrait of Tanya Berry. This white-haired 81-year-old is a fiercely independent thinker who embraces interdependence, someone with a deep humility who gives others credit reflexively and a self-confidence that makes her comfortable telling you what she believes she's good at. A kind person who doesn't hesitate to offer blunt advice. A woman who kept records of her prodigious canning in the kitchen, while also serving as discerning first editor of every novel and short story written by her prolific husband. My mother," her daughter Mary Berry says, "is a complicated woman." I would add only this. Tanya Amix Berry is an accomplished farmer, typist, editor, pianist, cook, and especially photographer. Ladies and gentlemen, Tanya Amix Berry. Yeah, if you want to get up and cartwheel, maybe pirouette around.
I don't have to do anything.
I would actually like to start a couple of years before. I guess I should tell everyone, we're going to do kind of a loose interview here. I'd like to show you a couple of the photographs, and then I know why we're here. So we'd like to open it up maybe for questions at the end for a little while before we get to the signing and the celebrating and the champagne popping and all the assorted there. But I would actually like to start a couple of years before the hog killing photos were taken and look at a few taken by your dear friend James Baker Hall for a collection called Tobacco Harvest: An Elegy, which is another fabulous book, and if you can get a hold of it, you should. I see this very much as kind of like a sister volume in a way to what we've got here. And there are a couple of reasons for that. For one thing, they're taken on the same farm. The photographs are taken on the same farm. They feature a lot of the same people in both, a lot of the same members of this agrarian community, which existed where we're from. It seems to me that Jim Hall was both, no, he wasn't just a friend, he was sort of an inspiration to you as a photographer, but I'd really like it if you could just expound a little bit on sort of what brought you into the arts, what got you thinking artistically, and sort of how you've applied that to your life, the life that you've built.
Well, I was raised mostly in California by a bunch of artists, and I never did not look at things artistically, which is the way we should all do. And so I've done many things along various lines, but when I started taking photographs, my father had been a photographer a bit and an artist. I found it a continuation to learn to frame scenes with the camera lens, and it was exciting to me to immediately to find out how you could lie with a camera as well as tell the truth. So anyway, that was all very interesting. Lo and behold, after all these years, these hog killing pictures, which were actually, I suppose, although I'd never thought till lately, that Jim Hall, whose son is sitting here, who teaches in the law school here, right? Okay. Anyway, so we've known him since he was born. So his father was a good photographer, a real photographer, one who knew the art very well. But he did a series of tobacco harvest pictures, photographs, and that was made into a book, which is a very important book for our country. But anyway, I think I probably thought, well, a series of pictures, we do a hog killing every year. I was then taking photographs for the Rodale people. They had sent me a camera to take photographs of Wendell's essays in their publications. So I was learning how to use it. So there I was, and so I took this series of photographs. And then I should add that Virginia and Ben looked at these photographs and decided that they were worth looking at a little more deeply. And so I am forever grateful to have people in the family who cared about about this. So I want to thank them, and it was both of them. And they've Ben has done a great job of reproducing the photographs. And anyway, I'm thankful for it. But that's I think, Matthew, is why I thought that you should take a series of photographs on the same farm that your dad was taking photographs. And of course, you and your dad and your mom and your brother were around a lot, and they were dear friends of ours. And thank you, Matthew, for the past and for being in the present too. Anyway, is that enough?
No, that's a good start. I want to touch on something that you said in there a little bit later on, especially in regards to kind of the community that was built up, having Jim around, having the family around. But in particular, what you said about that kind of artistic sensibility, that's something that your husband, Wendell, writes very convincingly about, and I think is one of the great strengths of his work, is to talk about kind of an artistic sensibility in one's life, especially in an agrarian life, where the things that you're doing, the self-provisioning, first and foremost, they have to be done with a kind of art. And he talks about that. If you have the book, I believe the first paragraph in his essay is just a fabulous description of that. But I wonder if you would talk about the floods as kind of a mirror image to this from the approach of farming. Owen and Lois Flood, who own the farm that appears in these photographs, the first 2 or 3 here from Jim Hall, and then you'll see when we switch over to Tanya's. But I wanted to show these just as a kind of an introduction to and some context for the hog killing photographs as well. Here, I'll point at him. There's Owen, and there's Lois Flood, the owners of this farm. And I know that they were, in many ways, instrumental to your all's development as farmers, as agrarians. Owen is oft quoted by your husband, and Lois is oft quoted by you, I know, just in personal conversation. Would you talk about...
Well, Owen had been my husband's mentor in a lot of ways. He was not educated very well, but he's about the smartest person we were ever around. And he was a really, really good farmer. So he and Lois were friends of ours, and we were around them a lot. So when we moved nearby, we started doing things like hog killing with them and learning these things. And she helped me even when Mary was a baby, a little girl. She taught me how to smock dresses, and she could sew, and she could cook. And all of this was art, as far as I was concerned. I mean, it's all an art. And so with Owen around and Lois as guides for a way of life, I think it did make a difference to me. Wendell had known that a long time, but I didn't come from that place, or that I had to learn all that stuff. So they were important to us as models, and married a long time, mm-hmm. Married and dear to each other, and the land was dear to them. And to me, that was a lot of learning that I did, and they made us welcome and never criticized. Mm-hmm. They never criticized. So anyway, they were just dear friends. But I think I saw in Lois, as well as other women in the community, of course, the art of her life. What made a big difference to me. I thought art was all over the place and in museums, and we were trained in this, but her whole life was an art, and his was too. And to design a field, make a field work the way it should and know it well enough and what to put on it, all of that was just a miracle to me. Wendell already knew it, and so it was a gift. It was a gift to have them. And then we had friends like Jim Hall, who were around a lot and got to know these people too. And Jim saw the beauty, I think, in the kind of farming that was going on in the tobacco culture in our area. It was perfect. You look at I don't know if you've got a picture, but after the tobacco was cut, those fields were perfect. They were clean. you just don't see work like that most places in
There's
farming. So
There's a quote that Wendell deploys a lot from Owen that I'm going to butcher here, but it goes something along the lines of, I weed my field for the same reason I clean my face.
wash my face.
Wash my face, sorry.
Yeah.
And that, I think that really speaks to kind of like you're saying, we think of art as a thing that we go to see. We think of art as a thing that we go to the museum and we open books, and that is, of course, a wonderful place to experience it. But to think completely about it, to have it consume your entire, being the way that it does in this sort of agrarian ideal that they I think they really represent.
And
That's
then
just a whole
Jim saw the
different.
beauty in it.
Yeah,
Wendell
absolutely.
said Jim was up there all the time, and Wendell said, this is going on now, and he was there. You might want to take a look at it, and he got it right. I mean, he could see it, and put it right.
I feel like that's kind of the role of the artist, and I think that's something that you do really effectively in these, because you are, and we'll get to some of yours here in just a second, but because you are so steeped in the place, the rootedness that you had in this culture by the time the hog killing photos were taken, you could in the way a great artist sees, you can look and identify what it is that is the art of, for instance, scraping a hog, as we'll see here shortly.
Well, the art of eating it afterwards, the art of having good food and
Indeed.
participating in it. And we just had, you think this stuff is gone, but it's not. And we just had a group at our church of young farmers who we're pleased to have in the church that I'm going to. And they just had a hog killing. They all did it together with the children. And then we had a big meal at church with the cooked hog, small weaning hog, with vegetables from all these farmers, and it was all local food, and it continues. It can continue, I hope. So I'm glad to see these now where somebody else can see the possibility. In fact, one person who participated in this hog killing lately said that the children had seen the hog killing photographs and the adults, and it kind of helped them understand what was going on when they did it themselves. So I was glad about that.
I think there's a lot to be said for how quickly it is that we lose these things without any record of them. Ordinarily in the past, the record would be you'd be there with your parents and your grandparents and your neighbors, enacting this ritual in the field year after year. I mean, we've got probably in this photo, this is the last of the Jim Hall ones that I have here, but you've got Den up in the front.
Yeah, that's our son, and I mean we were all, and then he was in the hog killing pictures too, and he was, well, anyway, it was
But yeah,
pretty nice actually.
you pass it along in that way, and absent that personal experience with it, there's got to be something that keeps it around. And I think that is one of the great values of photography as a medium, is that you can show more or less exactly. You can lie. Indeed, it's very easy to do so, but you can show some of the intricacies of this tradition in a way that just wouldn't be possible exclusively through the written word. And I think there's a lot of value to that. Let's move along here to... I lied, there is one more there. That's Owen in the center, Wendell on the right, and Den on the left there. Speaking of multi-generational passing on of tradition, or in this case, probably a joke of some description. They look like they're having a good time. But we'll move into the hog killing photographs here. And so we open and close the book with this spread here. I think this is a really important...
in your way.
Can you all see all right? I think this is a really important photograph. It's kind of markedly different from everything else in the series. And this shows, the traditional sort of gathering that would happen during and after the hog killing. We come from a place where tobacco was the primary cash crop, as we sort of constrain it by calling it that. But tobacco was a very difficult crop to industrialize, and so it relied a lot more on handwork for a lot longer than most other kind of major profit-producing crops. And what it required then was a lot of hands and brains in close proximity to one another all day, every day. And I believe the phrase goes something along the lines of, you're not done till everyone's done. Work sharing was a really important part of this. As Wendell says, there was never any accounting of it that he can remember. You just sort of assumed that it was settled up by the end. You would work on your neighbors' farms until the crop was in. And so that was sort of, I think formalized is the wrong word, but by getting together on the days of, Lois, in addition to doing a goodly bit of the actual physical difficult work out in the field, would also be cooking for how many people at a time,
A lot, and we all, of course, we all brought food too. That was normal enough that everybody pitched in, but she did most of it. But that was a normal get together on a work day. Yeah. Okay.
What would you, I guess, could you speak to the importance then of the social aspect of what you're doing? Because certainly you weren't only interacting with them, the people in the photos here in the field. It wasn't only work days that you all would get together. This was, we're sort of representing a time here where the kind of bonds of economy and community were, certainly much more tightly knit than what I grew up with, for instance, in a place that did not have a kind of binding force like this. Can you speak to that a little bit, just about how the work reinforced the non-work, how the work reinforced the play? Maybe would be a simple way of.
Well, yeah, the play and the fun made it possible to do the hard work that had to be done. So, and then the eating together is always important to continue communication as you need it. So, and then the women could show off their cooking ability. So, and it was considerable.
Through here, this is one of the photographs that we open the series proper with, and I actually want to jump ahead. Wendell writes in the essay a really wonderful piece about the whole day, but he's got a line in particular that I think is really important to consider, and in the work that we do is very important. And I think as we all think about food and where it comes from and who it is that's providing it, I just want to read this about Mob Ford, who's depicted here in these photographs. The premier artist of this day would be the shooter. In our crew, on the day pictured, as on all the others, that was Marvin Ford, known as Mob. In an industrial slaughterhouse, living animals are treated as if they are already dead. But the hogs we were preparing to kill that day belonged to this farm. And then a little bit later on, the men single one out, and with no commotion walk him into a corner. The shooter then is ready with his rifle, waiting for the hog to look straight at him, which is necessary for a sure kill. There are two pictures in this set that tell the story precisely. In the first, Mob has the rifle up, looking over the sights, but the hog is still looking away. In the second, the hog has looked straight at Mob, whose trigger finger has begun to tighten. The shot is fired, the hog goes down in blessed silence. The pair of young men rush in, turn the hog onto its back, and the sticker inserts his knife under the breastbone and into the heart. If it is done right, the hog will bleed out cleanly and completely. When this is done so quietly as we did it, the other hogs are not disturbed. I think that's a really, in sort of a time where I know recently we do a lot of work around beef production. There have been a couple of videos that have come out lately of industrial veal production that are horrifying. They're sickening. And having seen this, seeing these photographs and knowing the process and having seen it in our own community and things like that, it could not be a more radical departure from that ethos, from that, like he says, treating them as though they're already dead. In your life, on your farm, you all have raised lambs for meat for a great number of years now. Do you want to talk maybe about kind of the attitude in general towards this provisioning, towards this work? Reverence maybe isn't quite the word, although maybe in some ways it kind of is.
Well, in these photographs, one thing that when I got to looking at the photographs again was the fact that the hogs who had not been killed yet were not afraid. I mean, they were looking through the fence at hogs' heads hanging up on the fence, and they weren't afraid. And this hog wasn't afraid, wasn't trying to get away, and that makes you feel better about the meat you're going to eat. Mm-hmm. Is that they were treated decently and not afraid of what was happening to them. They were okay. They were okay. And it was, I've got to say, we quit this hog killing quite some years ago, and we have never had as good hams since, ever. We tried with green hams bought from somebody else and curing them, and they just never were as good.
Mm. Let's move through one or two more here. I want to stop and talk about this picture just because I love it so much.
Yeah.
This was a
he likes the ones that are out of focus. I have noticed.
That's because I'm very artistic, you see. I do think this kind of speaks to that, though, and I think the reason why this image is as powerful as it is, coming from a photographic background and, having done some media studies work and all that highfalutin stuff that apparently does get you a job. Who knew? But I think the really powerful thing about this, and the powerful thing about the cover, and this is Den, this is your son here, holding this knife out. The focus, and it should be said, she's very, very good at this. This isn't, she's using a very small rangefinder camera, which if you've ever used an old film rangefinder, you'll know that it's a little tough to nail it down sometimes. I'd nerd out on that later if anybody wants to. But it seems to me that the viewer here is kind of looking past something that is being offered to them. They're averting their eyes. They're sort of looking away. And in a lot of ways, I think that's sort of representative of a very modern attitude towards food in general, and especially meat. It does not concern one when one sees that McDonald's ad that we talked about earlier, where it is that stuff's coming from, who it is that's raising it, how they are being treated themselves in getting it to you, and everyone in between. I guess I don't want to harp on that too much, but I do want to, I don't know, could you talk about, and I guess could you talk about Den in particular, what it means to you to have your family involved so deeply in its own provisioning, in its own, do you see what I'm getting at there?
Well, it's the way it should be, and it isn't usually. But it's community work that honors the principle of taking care of your what you're going to eat. There was usually somebody at these hog killings who didn't was just kind of coming to observe, maybe to learn, but didn't understand about it yet, hadn't been through it yet. And we had, I remember one time the cardboard was laid out on the wagons, and somebody who was there visiting to help just climbed up on the wagon and walked across it, and didn't, and
It was there to keep the wagon, did a
To
lot
keep
of work
the-
on these big flat wagons to keep the meat
keep-
clean.
Yeah, and
to
he
keep them
just
off
he
of
just
the-
got up and walked across the wagon with his boots on, and that he obviously didn't see what he was doing. But I think the aspect of community work is what's important, a lot of importance here, and a thing. If you can get people to work together and eat together, you've got a possibility of a community that makes sense. And I was always pretty astounded at Mob. I don't think Mob ever missed on. I never heard of Mob missing on a shot. I never did, and he was a real genius with that gun, and he took his time. I remember there's kind of dance in these pictures and in the tobacco harvest pictures too. There's a dance of the community working together or working around each other that is pretty interesting to me. Mm-hmm. The ease of movement and its athleticism in some of it, and it's just bodies that work. It's good to see bodies that work the way they're supposed to. So.
I think you mentioned this there, and I think it's worth talking about. And actually, this next one, it's a perfect time to talk about it. The care, the artistry, the precision. This is a picture. This is Lois Flood, who owned the farm and whose husband had passed a few years before these pictures were taken. She was there with her son, Kevin, who appears in a couple of the other photographs. But Wendell also writes about this very photo, and that I will read very briefly. Well, maybe I won't. I don't know that I marked that one. He mentions that when you all were looking through these, you were moved by the fact that she was watching the outside of the tub.
Yeah.
You don't need to wash the outside of the tub. The inside of the tub is the only thing that matters. It's the only thing that's going to be touching the meat, the sausage that was going to be made in this. But that goes back to that care that Owen showed and the care that Lois showed. And I feel like we have an idea now that the butchering of meat, the slaughter and processing of meat is a filthy business. We don't want to look at it because it's dirty, it's messy, it's disgusting in some way. But I think one thing that really comes through in the photographs is the care that's taken. And like you say, the artistry of it, the athleticism of it, the precision of it.
The completeness of it, I think. And that's what that is washing the outside of the tub is doing the whole job. And so, yeah, her daughter, when she saw these photographs, Lois's daughter, Karen, she said her mother, and I don't know if you have any of them, but Lois would have her little finger up when she was working, and and of course she's gone now, but her daughter just loves to see her mother's little fingers sticking up at her work. So.
Well, there's a delicacy that that really comes through with a lot of these things. Like you say, people are taking their time. They're doing the work well. And I think a lot of that comes back to the economics of this, because this is self-provisioning. They're not doing work. They're not getting paid by the piece. They're doing this for themselves, for their collective selves. And I think it's kind of hard to overstate the importance of that in the care that's taken.
Right.
Let's move through one or two more here. I have a couple of these portraits. This is Meb Ford here.
That's Mob's brother, Mob and Meb.
Yeah.
And our nephew, Ray Baxter, who was working some with Kevin at that time on the farm.
There's a great picture of Kevin and Ray in the book, if you all, when you get to it. And then this one here, this is Eddie Sharp on the right. You want to talk about Eddie a little bit? I find Eddie fascinating.
Well, he is. He was tiny. He was very, very skinny and had a bad leg from childhood. But he'd be in the tobacco harvest pictures. He'd be up in the barn way up. He never hesitated to do any of the heavy work that came along. And he was just one of the local community that got together to do this stuff. He was something. He was. He's a sweet guy.
I think it's also interesting too that having a bad leg, it didn't, he didn't let it disqualify him from any kind of. This is a type of work that is adaptive, maybe in a way that some work today isn't. When you are making your own way, when you are making your own food, when you are making your own, it can work for you rather than you having to sort of adapt into it.
Yeah, and there were all levels of expertise or not in this. So anyway, and what I like is these things that happened, the events that happened in the agricultural year would include the outsiders who were around too.
Mm-hmm.
And they worked hard and learned hard, had to learn hard, but they were included too, just completely. I think I never heard any of them complain about being treated as though they were different.
Mm-hmm.
They were part of it. So
one or two more here. Let's see. Maybe I'll ask you one more kind of double long one here, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. And I'm gonna read this one because I wrote it down.
don't waste it.
Wouldn't want to waste it. At the end of the essay, Wendell writes about you, and I'm going to read that brief quote here. Because these photographs were made by Tanya Barry, they're extraordinarily intimate and revealing. Intimate because Tanya was one of us, and so nobody was distracted by her presence. Revealing because she knew the people and understood the work in its several stages, and she took part in our pleasure in working together. She knew what we meant by what we did. And that's been rolling around in my head for a goodly while now. It doesn't seem impossible, but it seems unlikely that these photographs would have the same impact that they do on the viewer if you weren't as rooted as you were by that point. If you weren't as integrated into the community. There's a documentary, everyone who's seen it knows that you are actually the protagonist of it, called Look and See, a portrait of Wendell Berry. But you talk about telling people this quote from Gary Snyder, to anyone who would ask, you all get a lot of letters and things like that of people asking what to do with their lives, and, I've come to a crisis, what is it that I should do? Should I go back and farm? Should I? And you always tell them what Gary Snyder said, which is, well, go somewhere and stop.
Stop somewhere.
Yeah. I wonder if you see that as, to tie this back in, kind of tie it all up, do you see that as kind of an artistic mandate as well as a social one? To go somewhere and find something and get to work.
Yeah. Well, people come through and say, to visit, and they would like to farm, or they, and you ask them where they're from, and they're not really from anywhere. They don't have any place to go back to, right? That. And it does. What Gary said comes to mind quickly. Then just stop somewhere, and you can make a home anywhere, I guess. Some places I'd rather not try, but yeah, it's all the art of making a home or making a place. It's been a wonderful experience for me because Wendell did have a place to go. I could have gone anywhere, I guess, because I've moved a lot, and but it is wonderful to stay somewhere long enough to get to expect the way the weather is and the seasons are and what the smells and the sounds are. Yeah, get somewhere and make a place. Stay somewhere, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll take a couple of questions if you all have any about Tanya and her work and life and etc. Anybody at all?
When you read Wendell's novels, and there are times when they're in stripping tobacco, which can be, I did that one time in Waddy, Kentucky, not
Did
far
you?
from y'all. And it's pretty drudge work, but the thing that kept it going was the storytelling. I could just be in stitches hearing story after story. And when Wendell writes about that in his books, you get a flavor of that. Did the hog killing allow, I mean, everybody's busy and you refer to it as a dance, so it's like, you know, there must be a lot of movement. Did it allow for a lot of storytelling during the actual process of the
Oh, everything allows for time for storytelling, as I can tell. Yeah, sure. And the same stories.
over and over?
Yeah.
They're always new.
Well, I've noticed that in our family, my husband will tell a story, and then my son will tell the same story over again, right then. It's a contest, I guess.
Just to make sure it sticks, I guess.
Well, his version of it, his take on it. Critics of language, yeah.
Well, it's an ever-evolving thing, you know.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
I had the good luck in Henry County a few times of being at the hog killings on the club farms, and my great-grandmother was still with us, and so she was in the kitchen where the bits and pieces came, and she was making souse
Yeah,
and head salt, whatever you
head
call
cheese,
that
I don't know what they call it.
And so I see at the end of the essay that Wendell mentions that the second day's work, you were busy with that work, and so we don't have photographs of that work when everything but the squeal was made into something. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about what you did have at the end of that work? What kinds of things, and because it's more than a package of pork chops from Kroger. You had quite a lot of food for the...
Yeah, and then we had the extended time for curing the joints, and that took 20 days, sort of, but we put them down with sugar and salt, you know.
So did everybody have a smokehouse still then?
We never did have a smokehouse available, I never tried it, so I don't know about that at all. But the dry cure,
I think we hung ours in the old smokehouse and never smoked.
but you hung them anyway. Yeah. But there was a lot of tangential work that isn't mentioned by Wendell in there. I mean, after it was all done, then there's, of course, we were lucky because we had a freezer and paper to wrap the pork chops and so forth, but there's a lot of work afterwards, and then the curing, as I say, goes on for a while, and then you have to hang the hands and shoulders, and then cooking them later is a big deal too. So, but I made the first time I got a hog's head, I knew you could boil them and get the meat off of them and make head cheese or souse, which I did, and first time I did it, I had the hog's head, you know, in a big pan, and its eyes kept looking at me, and I said I wasn't going to do that anymore. I asked for just the bottom of the head from then on. But that was not much fun. I had to learn it. We were lucky though. We didn't have to stuff the sacks of sausage because we took it to a local locker, and they did that. They ground the sausage after we seasoned it, and all this meat stayed separate, so we got our own hog. That is an important thing. I think when you think of that many hogs being killed, you think of it being mixed, but I think the lard maybe was. I think that was combined and divvied out. It's been a while since we did all that. But I know it was harder when you didn't have a freezer. When you had, they used to can sausage, and that was a lot of work. So.
And that's if we could touch on that just for a minute too. One thing that's been really interesting for me in kind of researching some of these processes and just speaking with you about it. And something that you see in the pictures, and Wendell references Lois as an excellent sausage maker, but it is remarkably easy to screw up a year's worth of work when you're kind of at this stage. One bad cut and you've lost most of a carcass. If you cut a gut when you're not supposed to, when you not that ever happened, for you all. But
I never saw it happen, but that doesn't mean it didn't. I may just not have been aware of it.
Yeah, if your salt ratio is off when you're putting the hams down.
Yeah, it's scary to season a year's worth of sausage and try to remember. I mean, I've got the recipes and I would change them every year. How much sage and how much salt. It's scary though that you might ruin the whole batch of it by putting too much red pepper in it, especially. So, yeah. And the ratio of red meat to fat and so forth, that's a touchy thing.
I wanted to know if you're still spending a lot of time behind the camera?
No.
You're not? Okay, well then the second part of my question.
We're working on it though.
Okay.
I'm thinking about it, but I when the digital age hit, I wasn't particularly interested in that, and I didn't want to do it that way. Which I understand I could have gone on with the old way, but I didn't. It's not a. One time we went to England for a trip, and I had a camera with black and white film and one with color. I had two cameras, and I spent the whole trip trying to figure out which one, if I wanted color or black and white, and that's kind of, it's distracting. And photography can be terribly time-consuming and distracting that way. So the grandchildren were a great subject, several of them.
And distraction, probably.
And distraction.
Yeah.
So these photographs were taken in 1979, right?
Yes.
Where have they been since 1979? What was the impetus for you to bring them out and publish them in this book?
Well, I just happened to have, I guess, Virginia around one day when I had the proof sheets. Isn't that the way it was?
I found them in the archives.
Oh, in the
At the Berry
archives?
Center.
I thought you found them up in the mess upstairs.
I thought you did too, and wrote about that to that effect in the editor's note. So you all bring me the book, and I'll cross it out, and I'll. But there's a considerable amount of photographic work that you did over the years that we have a lot of, and we'll see what happens. The sequel for The Hog Killing 1980, that'll be a big treat. 1979 too.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out.
And 1979 is a date for you, right, about the bookstore.
Mm-hmm.
That's in 40 years, huh?
Yeah. I will say, one of the blessings of technology, we were talking about our friends who did the hog killing this year. I shot Abby a text message, and she sent me a picture, so I've actually got the hog killing that our neighbors did. And it was the Club Farm. Is that the one right over there by Valley Spirit?
No.
Is that? No?
No,
Oh, well, I was hoping so. Sorry. But these are our friends. You can see a remarkable number of the things that we've just been talking about here. These are our friends. This is Caleb, whose farm they're on, who raises hogs already. They have a full diet CSA, and they sell direct at farmers markets and things like that. We are very, very fortunate in our county to have a small-scale USDA certified processor that the Berry Center helped kind of get up and running. So we're very blessed in that regard that our farmers only have to drive, 10 minutes to drop an animal off, and so smaller farms can take advantage of that in a way that they couldn't if they had to drive 4 or 5 hours. But Caleb raises excellent hogs. And I think one thing that's really interesting, they're working on the hog that they killed. You will notice that the other ones are not particularly perturbed. This is not what you would see in an industrial facility. I can assure you. There's video. I wouldn't recommend looking for it, but you can see what that process looks like. You can also see a bunch of children who are also pretty unperturbed about the whole thing, and that's remarkable. There are a bunch more of these photographs that I don't have with me here, but. Talking about that generational knowledge, and also talking about bringing someone into the process who wouldn't maybe ordinarily be in there. In the camo hat over here is a fellow named Ian, who's the husband of actually a member of Virginia's Agrarian Literary League Committee, who is an avid hunter and a good hunter who eats what he shoots, and just a pretty remarkable guy in a lot of ways. But he came out and killed it. He came out. He knows how to do it. He has learned how to do it. And he is not someone that you would associate with the full diet CSA, if you take my meaning. But this whole process, scalding and scraping and butchering, and then they actually ended up doing basically a whole hog barbecue for a church meal with all local produce around it.
Around it and in it.
Around it and in it, yeah. It was a remarkable thing, and it has genuinely changed people's lives and outlooks on kind of the way things are done. We're already talking about next year. We're already talking about a lot of things. But for the farmers, for the churchgoers, the members of that community, it's been a really remarkable thing. And I know we have some farmers in the room. If you all get a chance, if you've got someone around who knows how to do it, I cannot recommend highly enough. It really gets people thinking along the lines of where is this coming from, who is doing it, how many hands are on it, etc.
So, you mentioned that you came from California and you all came back to this place. Do you have some memory of how long it was before you felt like this was your place independently? We talk about changing the lives of other people as they come onto this farm or to your farm. That's a process, isn't it, to become integrated into that way of life and those people and that work?
Well, it's a process, sure, but I always felt as though Wendell's family was there already, and that was a lot of help to me to feel welcome there. I've heard other people say it's hard to get into a community and feel at ease with it. I never had that problem, I don't think, or I didn't realize it. I didn't see it. But people were good to me, I know that, and I was somewhat different from some of them, and they were sure good to me. If given half a chance, I hope other places are like that. I trust in it. But it didn't take, I felt like I didn't know what I was doing. Now that is a fact. I never felt like I was unwelcome, though.
You had other women showing you what to do.
Yeah, all you have to do is ask. Yes.
Piggyback on that question, I had the misfortune of admitting in graduate school how much I love yours and your husband's work together.
Oh,
And then I got yelled at by a woman who imposed the dynamic of, well, she's not getting her fair share of the credit.
right.
I just wondered about that dynamic and how it plays out on the farm, and does that kind of, I would say crap, come up in your
well, there's been, particularly the work I do for my husband, with my husband, for my husband. That's been, some woman asked me not too long ago at a public thing that Wendell was doing, and she said, do you mind if I ask you a question? I said, no, sure, ask me. And she said, well, I have a good friend who says that she's mad at Wendell because he's never paid you for the work you've done. And you know, my answer to that one has always been, because it's come up a lot, but is that we have a joint bank account. I really don't. And it's the way we can cooperate in our work, and that may be on a farm, small farm work, that when you work together with someone else, it makes the work better. And women's issues with being left out of farm work. I mean, Lois was in tooth and toenail to nearly everything on the farm, and she never felt misused. I guess that's one thing I saw in her that was important to me, was that she felt good about the work she did on the farm. The farm was hers too, and she never griped about being left out of anything, or about the kind of life she had. But I haven't heard too much lately of women's issues, as you're referring to. It happens.
Yeah, this was a while ago, but I wished I had your answer to respond to her. I'm glad to have it now.
Yeah. Well, Wendell had that why I'm not going to buy a computer article that just keeps getting republished. And when it first came out, the letters were awful about that. I mean, they were mean to him, and assuming that I was an underling, and that I, well, anyway, it was kind of rotten.
I assumed
It
you
was-
were an idiot.
Well,
I mean, that was the real outrage, that you just didn't, because you did something with
for
Daddy,
somebody,
for
for
Daddy,
instead of
Daddy,
with, yeah.
that you were sort of a non-person,
Right.
which is to know you. Is
Yeah.
to know.
I've been around a little while now, and I mean, I know who I think is getting the better end of this deal. But
Yeah. But I think farm work of a decent size, you know, of a decent kind, puts everybody to work together. So, and everybody having the same fears about the weather and the government and all that.
I do think what Wendell closes on in the essay too is interesting. I believe you mentioned it earlier, but I'll give you the short version here. And something that stood out to me watching it and seeing the photographs, it is noticeable that our second day of work was not as completely photographed as our first day. That is because on the second day, the photographer itself was busy at other work. The first day's work was accomplished almost entirely by the men, who after all needed to show that they were good for something. After only one day, the men needed the help of the women, which is about what you would expect. So, spoiler alert, that's how it ends. But I think it's pretty remarkable, too, seeing the photographs. There's a division of labor. I would say the stuff that is most easily screwed up and requires the most sensible work is done almost, seems predominantly by the women, which, again, I won't speak any value judgment on that. But you all are standing shoulder to shoulder doing this work. And looking at the tobacco harvest photographs, too. There's a recent video piece that I saw about kind of the mid-90s, tobacco harvest in the mid-90s, that there are almost as many women in the field as there were men. Sis Poe, who's a woman where we're from, was known as the best. I mean,
At cutting.
Tobacco, which is a very demanding physical job, Yeah.
And guess who we get to do it now? completely are Hispanics, migrant workers. Yeah.
There's a good blurb on the back from a fellow named James Rebanks, who's a shepherd, whose book you should also buy, Shepherd's Life, which is fantastic. But he talks about this a lot in his own writing, and I was really moved to see him say it in the blurb here too. We've given this over to strangers. This is work that's still being done on our behalf. We just aren't doing it anymore. We're giving it to people who are in far more precarious situations than we are. Immigrants, both legal and illegal, who are here trying to make a living. We give it to the poor. We give it to people of color, minority populations. Almost all meat processing done in the center part of this country is done by Latinos and African immigrants. The Somali population, Eritreans. That's who's doing it, and they're not being paid well. They're not working in safe conditions, and we're getting a worse product for it. I won't go too far down that road, but if you want to talk about the work of the Berry Center and what we're doing to advocate for people in a way that is different than the way things are, you can find us after while Tanya's signing.
I just want to say one more thing about the role of the female farmer
Certainly.
and the male farmer. The female farmer who also went into the field to drive the tractor during the tobacco harvest or hand the tobacco heavy and green sticks of 6 big heavy stalks off as it went into the barn. She also had cooked that midday meal for 7 to 12 to 15
Absolutely.
people and cleaned up after and then come back. And then she goes back in after that long day while the men usually were taking off their shoes and their dirty shirts and cooked the night meal and cleaned up after that. So I just want to put one in there for
Certainly.
for the farm women.
Certainly.
Who should
There-
never have been called farm wives because they never married the farm.
There-
But nonetheless.
There are a couple of really tremendous Jim Hall photos of Mary at about age 15 or so that I will not show because I value my career, of her exerting herself quite strenuously in the tobacco harvest, so you can look those up.
I just think we could stay here all night.
Absolutely, yeah,
And,
yeah.
I think maybe now's a good time to say thank you. It's a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, Tanya.
You can do it.